Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back roughly 700 years, pulling on a pair of thoroughly uncomfortable leather shoes, and wandering straight into the heart of a medieval city street. A place that smells absolutely nothing like anything you have ever walked through at your local farmer's market, and everything like somewhere you would probably not survive without a fairly robust immune system and a complete suspension of modern sensibilities around what counts as food. You are going to be jostled, you are going to be yelled at, someone is almost certainly going to try to sell you a meat pie of genuinely uncertain origin, and by the end of tonight, you might never look at a street vendor the same way again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from tonight and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in a completely different corner of the world is settling in for the same sleepy little history journey. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a medieval city. Let us say it is somewhere in England, France, or the Low Countries sometime around the 13th or 14th century, because that is the sweet spot where we have enough records to paint a proper picture without having to guess too wildly. The sun has barely cleared the rooftops. The sky is that particular shade of pale gray that promises either a cool, clear morning or a miserable drizzle by noon, and in Northern Europe during the Middle Ages, you would be wise to bet on the drizzle. The city is already moving. That is the first thing that strikes you, actually, how early everything begins. You, as a modern person, are accustomed to a world that eases into the morning with coffee machines and alarm snoozes and the gentle blue glow of a phone screen. The medieval city does not ease into anything. It detonates. By the time the first bells of the nearest church have rung out prime, which is somewhere around 6 in the morning, give or take, depending on the season, the streets are already filling with the kind of purposeful, slightly desperate human energy that only comes from a population that has absolutely no margin for a slow start. Craftsmen are opening their shutters. Those shutters, by the way, do double duty. They swing down to form a kind of counter or display surface on the street side of the shop, so that the transition from closed building to open for business stall happens in one loud wooden thump. Apprentices are hauling things. Livestock is being moved through streets so narrow that two loaded carts cannot pass each other without someone losing their temper, a wheel, or both. And threading through all of this, weaving between the carts and the pigs and the shouting men, are the vendors. The street food vendors of medieval Europe are one of the most fascinating and underappreciated features of urban life in the period, and they deserve a great deal more attention than history textbooks have traditionally given them. They are not a footnote. They are not a colorful background detail. They are absolutely central to how the medieval city functioned on a daily basis, because here is something important that you need to understand right from the start. Most people living in medieval towns and cities did not cook their own food at home on any kind of regular basis. That probably sounds strange to you, because you have grown up in a world where the kitchen is assumed to be a domestic space, a central feature of any home. But in a medieval city, particularly among the laboring poor and the middling artisan classes, a private kitchen was either a luxury you could not afford, a fire hazard your landlord had specifically forbidden you from creating, or simply an impossibility given the size and nature of your living space. Many urban dwellers rented single rooms, or portions of rooms, in crowded tenement-style buildings. There was no hearth available to them, or if there was, fuel was expensive enough that you thought very carefully before using it for anything as routine as warming up your own dinner. This is the economic and architectural reality that makes street food not merely a convenience in the medieval city, but an absolute necessity. The vendors who set up their stalls and wandered the lanes with their baskets and their portable braziers were not serving snacks to people who had perfectly good kitchens waiting at home. They were serving the primary meals of the day to a significant portion of the urban population. Historians still argue whether the majority of urban laborers in cities like London or Paris relied on street food as their main source of daily sustenance, or whether it served more of a supplementary role, but the evidence strongly suggests that for a very large number of people, whatever you bought from a vendor in the street was simply what you ate, full stop. The variety of these vendors is genuinely astonishing when you start to look at the records. Medieval cities, and we have particularly good documentation from London, from Paris, from the Italian city-states, from towns in Flanders, had regulatory systems, guild structures, and legal frameworks that generated paperwork, and that paperwork miraculously survives in some form. court records, guild ordinances, city bylaws, tax rolls, complaint documents filed by aggrieved citizens. All of these give us a remarkably textured picture of who was selling what, where, and for how much. The vendor you are most likely to encounter first thing in the morning, as you stand there blinking in the early light, is the bread seller. But we are going to give bread its own full section because it absolutely deserves one. The medieval relationship with bread is complicated, politically loaded, and full of surprises that your modern sourdough-appreciating brain is not quite prepared for yet. For now, note that bread is already in motion before you have fully woken up, carried in large flat baskets on the heads and arms of women who have been on their feet since well before dawn. What else is already out? The hot drink vendors, for a start. Not coffee. Coffee does not arrive in European cities until the 16th and 17th centuries, a fact that you suspect would have caused genuine existential despair among the people around you if they knew what they were missing. What they have instead is ale. Yes, ale in the morning. This is not considered remarkable or even particularly indulgent. Ale in the medieval period is a food as much as a drink. It is caloric, it is relatively safe to consume compared to water in many urban environments, and a thin, low-alcohol variety called small ale is very much a breakfast staple. But there are also vendors selling hot herbal drinks, warmed wine, and various spice concoctions that serve a similar morning beverage function, and we will spend much more time with the drinks culture later in our evening. There are also already, at this early hour, the sellers of cooked grain, bowls of pottage, which is a word that essentially means a thick porridge or stew made from whatever happens to be available. This is the workhorse food of the medieval world, the thing that a vast percentage of the population eats with extraordinary frequency, and it is available hot from street vendors who have kept their fires going through the small hours to be ready for exactly this moment. The smell of it, grain and onion and whatever scraps of fat have been stirred in, drifts through the morning air and mingles with everything else, the animal smell of the street itself, the sharper tang of a nearby tannery if the wind is wrong, the cleaner scent of fresh bread from an oven somewhere just out of sight. And the noise. Let us talk about the noise, because the soundscape of a medieval street market is something that really deserves a moment. The vendors call their wares, this is not optional, this is how they advertise, because there are no signs in any language that most of their customers can read. There is no social media post, there is no glowing menu board. There is a human voice, trained by daily repetition into something that can cut through the ambient din of a crowded street and land in the specific part of your brain that registers hungry. Medieval cities had specific calls associated with specific products, and some of these were apparently so melodically distinctive that they became a kind of urban folk music. There are later medieval and Renaissance compositions that actually incorporate the cries of London or Paris street vendors into their structure. A quirky little tidbit that gives you a sense of how deeply embedded these sounds were in the texture of daily life. The geography of the street food trade is also worth pausing on. It is not random. Medieval cities are intensely organized around the logic of trade, and the food vendors cluster in ways that reflect both official regulation and the practical dynamics of foot traffic. The areas around city gates are particularly rich hunting grounds for the hungry traveler, because that is where people arrive after long journeys. Tired, cold, and with money in their pocket that they are highly motivated to spend on something warm. The areas around churches are busy before and after services, when large numbers of people are in motion and a well-placed vendor with a basket of warm pastries is essentially printing money. The areas around the great market squares, which in most medieval cities are the gravitational center of commercial life, are dense with vendors of every description, and by mid-morning on a market day they are so crowded and so loud that you genuinely have to shout to be heard by the person standing next to you. You are that person in this moment, standing in the thickening crowd, and someone is already shouting at you. Not aggressively, well, not entirely aggressively, but with the enthusiastic professional insistence of a vendor who has been at this since 4 in the morning and has no intention of letting a potential customer drift past without making their pitch. What they are offering, what it costs, and whether you should trust it are all excellent questions, and they are questions we are going to spend the rest of this evening slowly and sleepily answering together. The city is awake. The fires are lit. The smell of things cooking on open flames and in clay pots and on iron griddles is beginning to layer itself into something rich and complicated and, if you can get past the top notes of horse and mud, actually rather wonderful. You have arrived at precisely the right moment, which is to say the messy, chaotic, gloriously human moment when a medieval city decides it is hungry and sets about doing something about it. Settle in a little deeper. Let your shoulders drop. We are only just getting started. You notice, as the morning progresses past that first pale hour, that the vendors are not all created equal. There is a hierarchy here, as there is a hierarchy in almost everything in the medieval world, a great chain of commercial being, if you will, that runs from the established baker with his permanent oven and his guild membership and his legally mandated loaf sizes all the way down to the woman with no fixed address and a basket of dubious pasties who moves quickly and makes a point of not making eye contact with anyone who looks official. The established traders are the ones with stalls, actual physical structures, sometimes quite elaborate, with a frame and a canopy and a defined footprint in the market that they may have paid for, inherited, or both. These people have overhead in the most literal medieval sense. They are known. They are accountable. If you buy something from them and it is terrible, you know where to find them tomorrow, and so do the market inspectors, who are a real and active presence in most substantial medieval urban markets. Then there are the hucksters, and this word, which has accumulated rather negative connotations over the centuries, originally refers simply to a class of petty traders who buy goods wholesale and sell them retail, often moving through the streets rather than occupying a fixed position. Hucksters are everywhere in the medieval city, and they occupy a legally ambiguous zone that the authorities are perpetually trying to define and regulate. They are essential to the food supply, particularly for people who live in parts of the city that are far from the main market, but they are also viewed with a certain institutional suspicion, partly because their mobility makes them harder to tax and harder to inspect. And then, below the hucksters, there are the truly informal operators. People selling food from their doorsteps, from handcarts, from baskets carried on their persons, sometimes from nothing more than a small fire lit in a convenient corner. These are people operating entirely outside any formal regulatory framework, and the records we have of them come mostly from the moments when they run afoul of someone with authority, a guild complaint, a court appearance, a fine for selling in an unauthorized location. These moments of friction are frustrating for the people involved, presumably, but they are gifts for historians because they preserve in amber a snapshot of exactly what was being sold, where, by whom, and for how much. What emerges from all of this, if you look at it long enough and let your eyes go a little soft and unfocused, is not a chaotic free-for-all but something more like an ecosystem. The various levels of the food trade occupy different niches, serve different customers, operate at different price points, and fill different gaps in what the city's population needs to get through the day. The formal baker and the informal street vendor are not really in direct competition. They are serving different ends of a market that is large enough and hungry enough to accommodate both. The day is brightening now. The bells have rung again. These bells are your clock, your calendar, your daily rhythm, and you learn to read them the way a modern person reads a phone screen, with the same slightly automatic glance and the same capacity to either register the information or tune it out entirely depending on what else you are doing. Mid-morning is here. The streets are at their fullest. The noise is extraordinary, and somewhere just ahead of you, through the crowd, a man with a large wooden tray strapped around his neck is hollering something that your brain, after a moment, resolves into a word you recognize. Pies. But that, as promised, is a later section. For now, just hold the image. You, standing in the medieval street, surrounded by the whole gorgeous, overwhelming, slightly malodorous spectacle of a city feeding itself. You are part of it. You are hungry. And there is food everywhere, if you know how to find it and are willing to take your chances. Which, for the sake of this evening's journey, you absolutely are. The bread arrives before almost everything else, and it arrives in quantity. You have to understand something fundamental about bread in the medieval world before we go any further, because if you approach it with your modern assumptions, bread as a side item, bread as something you pick up in a plastic bag from a supermarket shelf, bread as the thing you are currently trying to cut back on for reasons your medieval counterpart would find completely baffling, you are going to miss the entire point. Bread in the medieval city is not an accompaniment. It is not a vehicle for other things, though it serves that purpose too. It is, for a very large portion of the population, the meal, the primary, central, non-negotiable caloric fact of the day around which everything else is organized. A medieval laborer, a ditch digger, a porter, a construction worker hauling stone for one of those magnificent cathedrals that are going up all over Europe in this period. might consume somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 pounds of bread per day. Let that settle for a moment. That is not a supplement. That is a load-bearing structural element of a human diet, providing the majority of daily calories, and the streets of every medieval city are organized at the most fundamental level around getting that bread from the people who make it to the people who need it with the minimum possible friction and the maximum possible speed. The bakers are up before you can reasonably call it morning. The preparation of bread dough is not a quick process, and the oven's large, wood-fired, communal structures that retain heat with tremendous efficiency once they are properly going need time to reach the right temperature. In many medieval cities, the baker's oven is also available to local residents who want to bring their own dough to be baked, for a small fee, because private ovens in dense urban housing are, as we established last section, a fire risk that city authorities take extremely seriously. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is centuries away from where we are standing tonight, but the fear that generates ordinances against unauthorized home fires is the same fear, and it is not irrational. By the time the city is properly awake, the bread is already done. This is not bread that has been sitting around. The medieval consumer is actually quite particular about freshness in ways that might surprise you, and bread that is more than a day old occupies a different commercial category from fresh bread, usually sold at a reduced price and increasingly understood to be fit for different purposes, soaking in pottage, feeding to animals, or consumed by people whose options are limited enough that day-old bread is still a step up. The bread itself is not a single thing. This is another modern assumption worth dismantling quietly and setting to one side. When you picture medieval bread, you probably picture something brown and dense and vaguely austere, the bread of grim necessity. And there is certainly bread that fits that description: coarse maslin bread made from a mixture of wheat and rye, or bread made from rye alone, or in harder times from oats or barley, or even, in genuine scarcity, from dried peas or beans ground into a rough flour. This is the bread of the poor, and it is ubiquitous, and it is actually more nutritionally complex than the refined white bread that wealthy people prefer, though nobody in the medieval period is thinking about it in those terms. But there is also, in the better supplied urban markets, a whole range of breads that gesture toward luxury. Manchet bread, small, fine, made from well-sifted white flour, is the prestige product of the medieval baker's repertoire. The bread you eat when you want to signal that you have arrived, culinarily speaking. There are rolls and small loaves designed for individual consumption, which are particularly relevant to the street food context because they are portable in a way that a large household loaf is not. There are flatbreads, made on griddles rather than in ovens, which have a long history in the British Isles and across Europe, and which can be produced with much less infrastructure than oven bread, making them the perfect product for the more informal end of the street food market. And then there is the trencher, which is one of those medieval innovations that is so elegantly practical that you genuinely wonder why we stopped doing it. A trencher is a thick slice of stale bread, sometimes an entire small loaf hollowed slightly, that serves as a plate. You put your food on it, you eat your food off it, and then, depending on your circumstances and your level of hunger, you either eat the trencher itself or you give it to the poor or the dogs. The plate is edible. The washing up problem is solved. Historians still argue whether the trencher originated as a genuine plate substitute born of practical necessity, or whether it began as a more deliberate culinary choice. But either way, the result is a piece of food technology so sensible that it has been periodically reinvented ever since. You have almost certainly eaten food served in a bread bowl at some point in your modern life and thought it was charming and novel. And it is here to tell you that a 14th century Londoner would like a small word. Now, here is where it gets politically interesting, because bread in the medieval city is not just food. It is a regulated public utility, and the regulatory apparatus around it is one of the most elaborate and consequential in the entire medieval legal system. In England, the key document is the Assize of Bread and Ale, first formally articulated in 1266 but reflecting practices that are considerably older. The Assize sets out, with remarkable specificity, the relationship between the price of grain and the price and weight of bread. When grain is expensive, the loaf gets smaller but the price stays fixed. The baker cannot simply pass the cost on by raising prices because bread prices are controlled. Instead, the baker absorbs the fluctuation through adjustments in size and, theoretically, not through adjustments in quality, though as we will discover in our later section on food fraud, the gap between theory and practice in medieval food regulation is a very wide and very entertaining gap indeed. The enforcement mechanism is the bread weigher, an official whose entire job is to go around the market with a set of official weights and check that the loaves being sold actually match the standards they are supposed to meet. If a baker is found to be selling underweight bread, the penalties are not gentle. The most famous penalty is the so-called ride of shame, in which the offending baker is strapped to a hurdle with the substandard loaf tied around their neck and dragged through the streets for the entertainment and edification of the public. This is not merely humiliating. It is a calculated piece of social theater designed to reinforce the idea that bread fraud is not a minor commercial infraction but a genuine assault on the community's survival. When you are dealing with a population that depends on bread to the degree that the medieval urban poor depend on it, the person who cheats on their loaf weight is doing something genuinely dangerous, and the community treats it accordingly. The bread sellers themselves, distinct from the bakers in many cases, since the production and the retail of bread are often separate operations, are a constant presence in the street food landscape. Women dominate this trade in the street-level retail end, particularly in England and France, and they are known in the records by various terms: regraitresses, hucksters, or simply breadwomen. They buy bread wholesale from bakers and sell it at a small markup in locations around the city, particularly in areas far from the main baker's stalls, providing a delivery network that gets bread to the parts of the city that would otherwise have to make a significant journey to obtain it. These women are in a perpetually precarious legal position. The guilds, those powerful collective bodies that regulate trades in the medieval city, have complicated feelings about the breadwomen. On one hand, they are providing a genuine service. On the other hand, they are buying wholesale and selling retail, which puts them in commercial competition with the guild members who would prefer to handle that retail themselves. The result is a constant low-level regulatory war, played out in court records and guild ordinances, in which the breadwomen are periodically fined, restricted, or banned entirely, and then almost immediately resume operating because the city cannot actually function without them. There is a quirky little footnote here that genuinely delights me every time I think about it. In some medieval English towns, the breadwomen develop a specific legal status, a kind of tolerated illegality, where everyone knows they are technically operating outside the rules and nobody really does anything sustained about it, because the alternative is a city where large portions of the population cannot easily access bread. This is not a loophole or an oversight. It is a deliberate, if unacknowledged, policy decision. The authorities look at the situation, weigh the disruption of enforcement against the social stability of a fed population, and quietly decide that some rules are more aspirational than operational. It is, in its way, a rather sophisticated piece of urban governance. What does the bread actually taste like? As you stand there in the street and the breadwoman holds out a small round loaf for your inspection. This is a question that bread historians, yes, that is a real specialization and they are having a wonderful time, have spent considerable energy trying to answer. The grain is different from modern grain. Older varieties of wheat, less intensively bred, with a different gluten structure and a different flavor profile. The milling is different. Stone-ground flour retains more of the bran and germ than modern industrial milling, which changes both the nutrition and the taste. The leavening is different. Sourdough fermentation rather than commercial yeast, which means a slower process, a more complex flavor, a denser crumb, and a crust that has genuine structural integrity rather than the slightly theatrical crunch of a modern supermarket loaf. It is, by the accounts of people who have attempted to recreate it using period techniques and period grain varieties, actually rather good. Nutty, complex, with a slight sourness from the fermentation and a satisfying density that makes sense for food that needs to sustain physical labor over many hours. It is not the bread you are eating in your head right now, lighter, fluffier, more uniform, but it is bread that does its job with a kind of no-nonsense competence that you can respect. The small rolls and individual portions that dominate the street food end of the bread market are often slightly enriched. A little fat worked into the dough, sometimes egg, sometimes milk if the baker is feeling generous or the product is aimed at a slightly higher-end customer. These additions make the bread softer, more tender, more obviously pleasurable to eat, and they command a modest premium. They are the medieval equivalent of the artisan roll at a modern food stall. Essentially the same staple product, but with just enough extra care and ingredient to justify the upcharge. You take the loaf from the breadwoman's basket. It is warm, still holding the memory of the oven, and it fits neatly in one hand. The crust is firm enough that it does not immediately collapse, and the smell, that fundamental bread smell, the one that human beings have apparently been hardwired to find comforting since we first started baking things. Rises up and does exactly what it has always done, which is make you feel, briefly but genuinely, that things are going to be all right. You pay. The coin is small and worn. The bread woman has already looked past you to the next customer, because she has been at this since before dawn, and she will be at this until the bread is gone. And there is no time for lingering sentiment in a market that moves this fast. You tuck the loaf under your arm and keep moving. Around you, the bread trade is in full operation. Baskets being emptied and refilled. Weights being checked by sharp-eyed inspectors with an air of weary professional skepticism. A minor argument beginning somewhere behind you between a customer and a seller over whether a particular loaf meets the standard it has been sold as. The bread of the medieval city is not just calories. It is politics. It is law. It is community. It is the daily negotiation between producers and consumers and regulators over the most basic question a city has to answer every single morning. How do we feed ourselves today? The answer, for 7 centuries of European urban life, begins here with flour and water and fire and a human pair of hands that have been doing this long enough that the motion is entirely automatic, the feel of right dough indistinguishable from breathing. Bread sorted, moving on, because somewhere just ahead, through the crowd, that man with the wooden tray is getting closer, and the smell coming off it is doing very interesting things to your appetite. The pieman finds you before you find him. This is essentially always how it works. You are moving through the crowd, bread tucked under your arm, navigating the particular obstacle course of a medieval street at mid-morning. The handcart that has shed a wheel and is now blocking a third of the available passage. The cluster of people having an argument about something that is apparently very important to all of them. The pig that has no business being in this part of the street but has clearly decided that the concept of business does not apply to it. And then the smell hits you. Pastry, hot fat, something savory and deeply promising underneath. A waft of cooked meat and herbs and the faint sweetness of onion that has been cooking long enough to go gentle and yielding. Your feet slow down before your brain has consciously processed the decision. The pieman himself is a spectacle. He carries his wares on a large wooden tray suspended from a strap around his neck, so that the tray sits at approximately chest height and the pies are displayed on it like an edible still life. Some piemen have small portable braziers or warming vessels underneath the tray to keep the product at temperature. A piece of equipment that requires a certain amount of physical coordination to manage while also walking, calling your wares, and making change, and which must occasionally result in accidents that are both unfortunate and extremely difficult to explain. He is loud. He has a specific cry, a melodic, practiced thing that he has been refining for years, and it carries above the general noise of the street with the effortless penetration of something that has been acoustically engineered, through nothing but repetition and necessity, to do exactly that. The pie, as a form, is one of the great achievements of medieval food culture, and it deserves a moment of genuine appreciation before we start poking at its more questionable aspects. The pastry casing of a medieval pie, called a coffin, which is a word that immediately tells you something about the medieval relationship with whimsy, is not primarily intended to be eaten. This is the thing that surprises most people when they first encounter it. The coffin is a container. It is a cooking vessel and a serving vessel and a transport vessel all in one, made from a thick, sturdy paste of flour and water or flour and fat that is robust enough to hold its shape through the cooking process and to be carried around a street market without structural failure. Whether you eat the coffin at the end is a matter of personal preference and economic circumstance. A wealthy diner might leave it, a hungry laborer absolutely does not. But its primary function is not gastronomic. It is engineering. Inside the coffin is where the pieman's art and the pieman's character are both revealed, and not always in equal measure. The legitimate fillings of a well-made medieval street pie are genuinely appealing. Small birds, sparrows, starlings, larks, are extremely common, because they are cheap and widely available, and their small bones cook through thoroughly enough to be manageable in a handheld pie. Eel is popular, particularly in cities near rivers or coasts, and eel pie has a long and respectable history in English food culture that persists right up to the 20th century. Pork, beef, mutton, whatever is available and affordable, appear frequently, usually in small pieces rather than as a solid mass, often extended with onion and herbs to make the meat go further. Herbed mixtures of organ meats, liver, kidney, lung, are extremely common and carry no particular social stigma in a period that wastes essentially nothing from a slaughtered animal. The herbs involved are typically what is locally available and affordable: parsley, sage, hyssop, savory, sometimes a little ginger or pepper if the pieman is trying to move up in the world. This is where the record gets genuinely interesting, because we have court documents, medieval cities being very litigious places with very meticulous clerks, that describe specific fraudulent pie practices in enough detail to make a modern food safety inspector quietly put their head on their desk. The London Assize Records and the records of the Cook's Company, which is the guild with oversight responsibility for cooked food sellers in medieval London, contain complaints and prosecutions that read like the world's least appetizing restaurant reviews. There are documented cases of piemen using meat from animals that died of disease rather than slaughter. There are cases of putrid meat being heavily spiced to mask the smell, and this, incidentally, is one of the genuine historical drivers of the spice trade's importance, though we will get to spices in their own section. There are cases of pies being filled with a mixture of meat and other, less identifiable substances, bulked up to a weight and volume that suggests the actual meat content is doing a lot of heavy lifting for a rather small supporting cast of ingredients. There is at least one documented case in 14th century London of a cook shop being prosecuted for using meat that was described in the court record with a Latin phrase that translates, with admirable restraint, as wholly putrid and poisonous. The business apparently reopened after the fine. And this brings us to one of the most persistently entertaining figures in the entire landscape of medieval street food: the regrader who operates in the gray zone between salvage and fraud. Leftover meat from wealthy households, the remains of yesterday's roast, the scraps from a feast, the bits that did not make it onto the Lord's table, flows downward through the social system via a fairly well-established network of resellers. By the time it reaches the street pie market, it has often passed through several hands and gained several days of age, and what the pieman does with it next is a question that the historical record occasionally answers in ways that you might prefer it had not. Here is the quirky fringe detail that I find absolutely impossible to leave out. There is a recurring character in medieval European folklore and in some contemporary satirical literature, the pieman whose pies contain things so unidentifiable that they become a kind of running joke about urban food anxiety. The most extreme version of this anxiety crystallizes, centuries later, in the legend of Sweeney Todd. But the cultural DNA of that story, the fear that the meat in your street pie is not the meat you were promised, runs all the way back to the medieval market and the entirely reasonable suspicion with which a moderately informed medieval consumer regarded the filling of a pieman's product. Historians still argue whether actual cases of truly fraudulent filling, not just old meat or low-quality cuts, but something more dramatically wrong, were common enough to justify this cultural anxiety or whether the folklore exaggerates a much rarer reality. The court records suggest that bad meat was a genuine and recurring problem. The more colorful version of events is probably embellishment. Probably. What you, standing in front of the pieman right now, actually do is apply the same practical consumer logic that your medieval contemporaries have developed through experience. You look at the pie. You smell the pie. This is not a casual sniff but a genuine olfactory inspection, the kind your many times great-grandmother would have recognized immediately as a survival skill. You look at the pieman's face, at his stall, at the general condition of his equipment, and you make an assessment of his commercial reputation based on the size and apparent satisfaction of the crowd around him, because in a world without Yelp reviews, foot traffic is your 5-star rating system. The pieman you are standing in front of has a respectable crowd. This is a good sign. You hand over the appropriate coin, a halfpenny perhaps, or a penny for something more substantial depending on the city and the period, and you receive a pie that is warm and solid and smells genuinely of something you want to eat. The pastry is thick and a little gray because the flour used for pie coffins is not the fine white stuff reserved for manchette bread. It is functional, structural flour, and color is not really the point. The filling, when you break through the crust with your thumb, releases a puff of steam and the smell of cooked meat and herbs becomes suddenly much more specific and much more present. It is, you decide, actually quite good. The meat is, well, you are not entirely certain what the meat is, which is a very medieval experience and one that you are learning to simply accept as a feature of urban eating in this period. It is tender, it has been cooked with enough onion and herbs that the flavor is rounded and savory, and there is a small amount of gravy inside the coffin that has reduced during cooking into something glossy and intensely flavored. You eat standing up because that is how street food works, and you watch the pieman work the crowd around you with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this long enough that the patter is entirely automatic. He has a joke. Most piemen have a joke or a catchphrase, or some small performance that distinguishes them from the other piemen operating in the same area. Because in a market where multiple people are selling the same basic product, personality is a competitive advantage. His is not a particularly sophisticated joke. It involves a knight, a miller, and a pastry that I will not fully recreate here because the medieval sense of humor tends toward the extremely earthy in ways that are perfectly in keeping with PG-13 but require a bit of setup. But the people around him laugh, and the laughter loosens wallets in the way that it always has. The pieman's day is long. He typically buys his pies from a baker or a cook shop that produces them wholesale, rather than making them himself, which puts him in the same huckster category we discussed earlier, buying at one price, selling at another, occupying the crucial last-mile role between production and consumption. Some piemen do produce their own, particularly the more established ones with a fixed pitch in a good location, and these people have a genuine investment in their product's quality because their location is known and their customers are repeat customers whose loyalty is worth preserving. The variety of pies available on any given day in a well-supplied medieval city market is larger than you might expect. Beyond the meat pies, there are fish pies, particularly important on the many fast days mandated by the church calendar, when meat consumption is forbidden and the city's entire protein economy pivots to fish. There are pies that lean sweet, filled with dried fruit and honey and spices, occupying the dessert end of the spectrum. There are what we might call transitional pies, filled with egg and cheese and herbs, that do not fit neatly into sweet or savory categories but instead inhabit that medieval culinary middle ground where the distinction between the two is considerably less firm than your modern palate expects. Fast days, incidentally, are worth a brief pause because they are absolutely central to the rhythm of medieval street food. The Catholic Church mandates abstinence from meat on Fridays, on Saturdays in many traditions throughout Lent, and on a scattering of other occasions throughout the liturgical year, which adds up across the full calendar to somewhere between a third and half of all days. The street food market shifts dramatically on these days. The meat pie sellers are doing considerably less business. The fish sellers, fresh fish, salted fish, dried fish, smoked fish, pickled fish, fish in every possible form that preserving technology can achieve, come into their own. The pottage vendors alter their recipes. The whole city pivots, with the well-practiced ease of long habit, to a different mode of eating, and then pivots back again when the fast is over. There is a genuinely fascinating economic consequence to this system. The fish trade in medieval Europe is enormous, and a significant portion of its scale is driven directly by religious dietary law. The herring fisheries of the North Sea, the cod fisheries of Iceland and eventually Newfoundland, the vast salt trade that makes preserving fish economically viable across long distances. All of this is underpinned, at the consumer end, by the fact that a very large number of people are religiously obligated to eat fish on a regular basis and are willing to pay for it. The pieman on fast days has a fish pie, and you buy that instead, and the chain that connects your lunch to an Icelandic fishing boat is longer and stranger than you could possibly trace from where you are standing. But today is not a fast day. Today is a meat day, and the pie in your hand is warm and savory and finished, the empty coffin heavy enough that you consider eating it too, and you do because you are hungrier than you realized, and because waste in this world is not something that your body has been trained to default to. You brush the last crumbs off your hands and look up. The morning is getting on. The crowd is at its thickest now, and from somewhere deeper in the market, around a corner you have not yet turned, past a junction that smells of horses and something more aromatic, there is the sound of a large pot being stirred, and a voice calling something about soup. Your feet, with the unerring instinct of the historically curious and the perpetually peckish, turn toward it. The smell reaches you before the stall does, which is the correct order of operations in a medieval market and the one you are quickly learning to navigate by. It is a deep smell, not sharp, not bright. Nothing about this smell is trying to get your attention the way the pie smell did, with its aggressive waft of hot fat and herbs. This is a smell that has been building for hours, maybe since before dawn, a slow accumulation of warmth and starch and the faint sweetness of root vegetables that have been cooking long enough to surrender entirely to the heat. It is the smell of something that has been tended rather than made, something patient, something that required a kind of sustained attention that is fundamentally different from the quick transaction of the pie stall. It is the smell of pottage, and it is, in the most literal sense, the smell of survival for a very large percentage of the people around you. Pottage is the word, and it is a word that covers a lot of ground. At its most basic, pottage is simply anything cooked in a pot, a broth, a porridge, a thick stew, a thin soup, a grain-based slurry with bits of things in it, or a rich, meaty, herb-laden preparation that, in another context and another social setting, might be served at a lord's table without embarrassment. The word does not specify texture, does not specify ingredients, does not specify richness or poverty of content. It specifies a method. Something liquid, something heated, something that comes in a bowl and requires a spoon or, in the absence of a spoon, a piece of bread to scoop it up with. The trencher, remember, from our earlier conversation, the bread plate, is doing double duty here, serving as both bowl liner and eating implement in one magnificently efficient gesture. The cookshop and the pottage stall are, in many ways, the most important food institutions in the medieval city that modern people know the least about. The bakeries get written up because bread law is so elaborate and so consequential. The taverns get written up because alcohol generates drama, and drama generates records. But the cookshops, the establishments that maintain large cooking fires, keep pots going continuously, and sell hot prepared food to the urban population, are the daily engine of working-class nutrition, and their story is told mostly in the mundane background hum of administrative documents rather than in the exciting foreground of legal scandal. Which is perhaps why they have been somewhat neglected. They were too important to be interesting in the archival sense, and we are going to correct that right now. A medieval cookshop is not quite a restaurant in the modern sense, though it is the closest thing that the medieval city has to one. It does not have tables in the way you are imagining. It does not have a menu printed on a chalkboard, or a host who shows you to your seat, or the expectation that you will linger over multiple courses while someone refills your water glass. It is, at its most basic, a place where fire is maintained and food is available, and the transaction is quick and functional. You come with a vessel, your own bowl or pot if you have one, or you come without one and pay a small additional amount for the use of the shops, and you leave with food. The whole interaction might take 30 seconds. It is fast food in the most literal sense of the phrase, predating the drive-through by about 700 years and operating on essentially the same principle. Hot food, quick service, no fuss. The pottage itself comes in grades, and the grade you receive is a direct function of how much you are paying and what the cookshop supply situation looks like on any given day. At the bottom end is blanc pottage or white pottage, a thin, grain-based preparation, essentially a very loose porridge of oats or barley cooked in water or very thin stock, with perhaps a little salt and a handful of whatever green herbs are available. This is food at its most functional. Keeps you alive. It is warm. It fills the stomach in a way that nothing cold and uncooked quite manages. And in a world where the relationship between warmth and survival is considerably more direct than it is in your centrally heated modern life, that warmth is not a trivial thing. One step up, you get pottage with legumes, dried peas, dried beans, lentils, which add protein and body and a kind of thick, starchy richness that makes the bowl considerably more satisfying. Peas pottage, made from dried split peas cooked down to a smooth, dense mass, is one of the great staple foods of medieval Europe, and one that you almost certainly know by cultural reputation even if you have never eaten it, because the nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old, is encoding an actual social reality. The pot does not get emptied and scrubbed every day. New ingredients are added to what remains, the fire is kept going, and the thing in the pot is a continuous, evolving preparation rather than a discrete recipe with a beginning and an end. 9 days old is perhaps a slight exaggeration for comic effect. Probably. Historians still argue whether the continuous pot method was genuinely as common as the folklore suggests, or whether it represents a poetic condensation of what was actually a somewhat more managed and refreshed process. But the basic reality, that pottage in cookshops and homes was often a running preparation rather than a daily fresh batch, is well supported by the economic logic of the situation. Fuel is expensive. Keeping a fire going continuously is more efficient than starting one from scratch every morning. The pot stays warm, the contents evolve, and you do not throw anything out that still has nutritional value to give. At the higher end of the pottage spectrum, things start to get genuinely interesting. More true, which appears in medieval recipe collections with some frequency, is a pottage that has been taken to a different level of refinement. Meat or fish pounded smooth and combined with almond milk and spices and breadcrumbs as a thickener, producing something closer to a cream soup than to peasant porridge. Blancmange, and yes, it is a medieval dish, not a 20th century invention, and in its original form it is nothing like the wobbly pink nursery dessert that the word conjures in a modern British imagination. Is a white pottage made from chicken or fish, rice, sugar, and almonds, and it is firmly in the luxury register, available in cookshops serving a more prosperous clientele. The cookshop that you are approaching now is somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, which is probably the right place to be for our purposes. It occupies a permanent structure, a building with an open front facing the street, a large hearth visible from outside, several pots of different sizes in various stages of deployment, and a proprietor who is simultaneously stirring one pot, directing an assistant, and conducting a transaction with a customer at the front, all with the air of someone who has been doing this for long enough that the complexity no longer registers as complexity. It just registers as Tuesday. The assistant is a young person of indeterminate gender. Medieval cookshops employ both men and women, and the records show women running these establishments as independent operators with some regularity, particularly as widows continuing the trade of a deceased husband, though also simply as businesspeople in their own right. The cookshop trade is one of the areas of medieval urban commerce where women have a meaningful presence, partly because cooking is culturally gendered in ways that make female practitioners less threatening to male guild structures than they might be in other trades, and partly because the economics of the small cookshop, high labor intensity, thin margins, constant operation, make it a business model that fits the pattern of family enterprise where everyone who can work does work. You join the short queue because there is always a short queue at a good cookshop at this hour, the late morning being peak demand time as the population that has been working since dawn hits its first serious hunger wall, and you have a moment to look at what is being served. There are two large pots going on the main fire, and from where you stand you can see that one is darker than the other, which suggests a meat-based stock in at least one of them. There is a smaller pot to the side that appears to contain something with fish, because the smell coming off it is distinctly different. Not unpleasant, just unmistakably aquatic. On a shelf behind the proprietor, there are small ceramic bowls stacked with the casual confidence of someone who goes through a lot of bowls on a daily basis. There is a wooden paddle leaning against the side of the hearth that serves as a stirring implement for the larger pots, and it has the darkened, slightly encrusted patina of an object that has seen years of continuous use. It is, in its way, a beautiful object, the tool of a skilled person's daily practice, worn into perfect functionality. You reach the front of the queue. The proprietor looks at you with the brisk, assessing gaze of someone who has been reading customers since before you were born in the medieval sense and asks, with a gesture as much as with words because the medieval market is a noisy place, what you want. You point to the darker pot. The proprietor ladles out a portion into a bowl, your bowl if you had one, or the shop's bowl for a small extra coin. And the result is something that you could call a meat pottage, but that really deserves a slightly more evocative description. It is thick. It is brown, the brown of long-cooked meat and stock and the slight caramelization of onions that have been in the pot since early this morning. There are chunks of something, pork, probably, or possibly mutton, tender enough to be falling apart, suspended in a liquid that has reduced far enough to have genuine body, genuine coat, the spoon consistency. There are shredded herbs on top, added at the end to keep their brightness. There is a piece of bread balanced on the edge of the bowl that is going to serve as spoon, plate, and additional calorie source simultaneously. It is, in the most unfussy and unpretentious way possible, excellent. This is the thing that I think gets lost when people romanticize medieval food in one direction or dismiss it in the other. The people cooking it were not operating without skill. They did not have the global pantry of ingredients that a modern cook has access to. They did not have thermometers or precise measurement or consistent fuel sources, but they had generations of accumulated knowledge about how to coax maximum flavor from limited materials, how to manage a fire, how to time the addition of ingredients so that everything reaches the right state of doneness at the same moment, how to use fat and salt and the natural glutamates in long-cooked bone stock to make something satisfying and complete from ingredients that are individually humble. Medieval cooking at the street level is not refined cuisine in the sense of elaborate presentation and expensive ingredients, but it is genuinely skilled cooking, and the people doing it have earned their skills the hard way, and the food shows it. The wider cookshop world includes establishments that are considerably more elaborate than the pottage stall you are standing at right now. In larger medieval cities, London, Paris, Florence, there are cookshops that offer roasted meats, elaborate pastries, sophisticated sauces, and the kind of multi-course meal experience that wealthy travelers and prosperous merchants expect when they are away from their own household kitchens. These establishments blend into what we might recognize as proto-restaurants, though the terminology is complicated and the category boundaries are blurry in ways that medieval people themselves do not seem to have worried about very much. The important thing is that the cooked food service industry in the medieval city is large, varied, and capable of serving every level of the social spectrum, from the laborer spending a halfpenny on a bowl of peas pottage to the traveling merchant spending several shillings on a proper dinner with wine. There are also establishments that blur the line between cookshop and tavern, places where you can get food and drink in combination, where there are benches to sit on, where the transaction is slightly less purely functional and slightly more social. These are the ancestors of what will eventually become the inn and the alehouse and, much later, the pub, a continuous thread of communal eating and drinking in semi-public spaces that runs from the medieval cookshop right up to the present day with relatively little interruption. The communal nature of the cookshop is itself worth dwelling on. In a world where private cooking is limited by fuel costs and equipment and space, the cookshop is one of the few places where the act of eating a hot meal can happen outside the family unit. You eat next to strangers. You share bench space, bowl space, fire warmth. You overhear conversations. You see what other people are ordering and occasionally ask the person next to you what it is they have got, because it looks good and you are curious. The cookshop is a social institution as much as a commercial one, and the city's information network, gossip, news, rumor, the kind of street-level intelligence that moves faster than any official communication, flows through it with the same efficiency as the soup. You eat your pottage slowly because the morning has been full and your feet are tired, and this is the first moment you have had to simply stand still and be warm. The bowl is deep enough that the contents stay hot, and each spoonful, each bread scoop, rather, is as satisfying as the last. Around you, the cookshop does its business, the proprietor moving with that particular efficiency that belongs to people who have made the same set of motions so many times that the body has simply internalized them as its default state. Outside, the market continues. Voices layer over each other in the particular acoustic texture of a crowd, punctuated by the occasional sharp sound of something being dropped, or a burst of laughter, or the distant bell of a church marking the passage of another hour. You finish the pottage. You finish the bread. You set the bowl down on the ledge provided for this purpose, the return of crockery to the cookshop being a logistical necessity that the proprietor has clearly thought through very carefully, because the bowls are stacked within arm's reach of the street-facing counter and customers return them with the automatic ease of a system that has been in place long enough to become invisible. You are warm now, and full in the specific solid way that starchy food creates. Not the bright, quickly metabolized fullness of sugar, but the deep, lasting fullness of grain and legume and slow-cooked meat, the kind of fullness that your body recognizes as serious nutrition and responds to accordingly. Your eyelids, if this were actually bedtime rather than a story about a medieval market, would be growing heavy right about now. But there is more to see. The morning is sliding toward midday. The market is shifting because markets in the medieval city do not maintain a single character throughout the day. They evolve hour by hour as different vendors reach their peak and others wind down, as the goods on offer change with the depletion of morning stock, as the social composition of the crowd shifts from the early workers to the more prosperous midday shoppers who move through the market with a different pace and a different set of priorities. And somewhere in this shifting crowd, something sweet is being made. You smell the honey first. It comes to you as a thin golden thread woven through the heavier base notes of the market, the meat and the grain and the wood smoke and the ever-present animal undertone of a city that has not yet separated itself from its livestock. And it is so distinctly different from everything else around. You that your nose finds it immediately and holds onto it with the focused attention of someone who has just located something genuinely rare. Because in the medieval world, sweetness is rare. Not absent, but rare enough and expensive enough and socially loaded enough that the smell of it in a street market context carries a particular charge, a small electric thrill of something that sits just at the edge of what ordinary daily life usually provides. Sweetness in the medieval period is primarily the domain of honey, and honey is everywhere in the European Middle Ages in a way that tends to surprise modern people who have defaulted to sugar as the default sweetener for so long that honey feels like a specialty item. A thing you drizzle artfully over cheese at dinner parties. In the medieval world, honey is the workhorse. It sweetens food, it preserves food, it ferments into mead, it goes into medicine, it seals wounds, it waterproofs things, and it shows up in enough culinary contexts that the keeping of bees is a serious and widespread agricultural practice rather than a hobbyist pursuit. Every monastery keeps bees, because monasteries need wax for candles as much as they need honey for food, and the byproducts of ecclesiastical candlemaking fuel a substantial portion of the medieval sweet tooth. The stall you are moving toward now is run by a woman whose age is difficult to determine in the way that the ages of people who work outdoors in physically demanding conditions are always difficult to determine. She could be 35 or she could be 55, and the confidence with which she moves around her equipment suggests that the answer does not particularly matter to her. She has a small brazier, a collection of flat iron griddles, and a series of ceramic molds of different shapes, and what she is making right now in front of you is wafers. Wafers are one of the great unsung heroes of medieval street food, and the wafer seller, the waferer in period terminology, is a fixture of urban markets across medieval Europe with a presence documented from at least the 12th century onward. The basic wafer is a thin, crisp confection made from a batter of flour, eggs, and water or wine, poured between two hinged iron plates engraved with a pattern, geometric designs, religious imagery, heraldic motifs, sometimes simply a texture that helps the finished wafer release from the mold, and cooked quickly over the fire until it sets into something light and faintly crisp with a delicate, eggy sweetness. In their most basic form, wafers are not particularly luxurious, but they are an enormously flexible format, and the wafer working the street market can position them anywhere from everyday affordable treat to something approaching genuine luxury depending on what goes into the batter and what goes on top. Honey is the standard sweetener, sometimes supplemented with spices. Ginger is extremely common. Cinnamon appears. Anise is used in some regional traditions. The more elaborate versions incorporate wine into the batter rather than water, which produces a slightly richer, more complex flavor and also a product that costs more and therefore signals something about the purchasing power of the person buying it. At the luxury end, there is cheese worked into the batter, the medieval equivalent of a cheese waffle, which sounds like something a very creative modern brunch restaurant would serve, and which is, by all reconstructive accounts, quite delicious. The wafer iron itself is a beautiful piece of equipment, and this is not a trivial observation. The quality and elaborateness of a wafer's iron is a genuine indicator of their status and their market positioning. Simple irons produce simple patterns. Elaborate irons with deeply engraved heraldic designs or religious scenes produce wafers that are, in addition to being food, small works of decorative art. And these command a premium not just for their taste but for their appearance. Medieval people care about the aesthetics of food in ways that are more sophisticated than the brown and functional stereotype allows for, and the wafer is one of the clearest expressions of this, a food that is openly, consciously beautiful, designed to be looked at as well as eaten. The wafer hands you one warm from the iron. It is thin enough to be nearly translucent at the edges, where the batter spread thinnest before it's set, and the center is slightly thicker, slightly chewier, with the honeyed sweetness of the batter concentrated where the mass is greatest. It smells of egg and honey and the very faint ghost of ginger, and it makes a sound when you bite into it, a delicate, papery snap that is immediately and completely satisfying in the specific way that contrasting textures always are. It is gone in 3 bites, which is exactly right for street food. It leaves you wanting another, which is exactly right for commerce. You buy another one. Obviously, the sweet end of the medieval street food market is smaller and more socially stratified than the savory end, but it is considerably more interesting than its size might suggest. Sugar is the key variable here, and the story of sugar's arrival and gradual penetration into European street food culture is one of the most consequential and, in retrospect, most troubling stories in the history of food. Sugar cane is not native to Europe. It comes, in the medieval period, from the Middle East and North Africa, and its arrival in significant quantities in European markets is tied directly to the Crusades, the military campaigns that bring European soldiers and merchants into sustained contact with a food culture that has been using cane sugar as a flavoring and preserving agent for centuries. The Crusaders encounter sugar and they want it, and the trade networks that develop to supply that one are complex, expensive, and involve a chain of middlemen and markup that ensures sugar arrives in northern European markets at a price that places it firmly in the luxury category. For most of the high medieval period, the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, sugar is a spice. This is not a metaphor. It is categorized, traded, stored, and used alongside pepper and cinnamon and ginger as an exotic imported flavoring available only to the wealthy. A medieval recipe that calls for sugar is a recipe written for a household with serious money, and the quantities specified are always small. A pinch, a little, a dusting, because the stuff is precious enough that even wealthy cooks treat it with a restraint that reads, from our modern perspective of unlimited sugar availability, as almost comically careful. What this means for the street food market is that genuine cane sugar in street food is essentially non-existent for most of the medieval period. The sweet street foods available to ordinary people are sweetened with honey, with dried fruit, raisins, currants, figs, dates, all of which have their own supply chains and their own price points but are generally more accessible than cane sugar, or with the natural sweetness of ingredients like apple, pear, or the concentrated sweetness of reduced grape must, a thick syrup made from wine grapes that is used extensively in southern European cooking and that travels north with some regularity. The honey cakes available from certain street vendors are a good example of how sweetness is democratized in this environment. A honey cake, a dense, sticky, spiced confection with a texture somewhere between modern gingerbread and a very robust brownie, is made from flour, honey, fat, and whatever spices the baker can afford, and it is the kind of food that makes the most of what it has. The honey provides sweetness and also acts as a preservative, which means honey cakes have a longer shelf life than many other sweet foods and can be made in batches and sold over several days without significant quality loss. This makes them practical for street vendors who cannot afford to have unsold inventory go to waste at the end of the day. There is a quirky and rather wonderful tidbit buried in the history of medieval sweet street food that I cannot resist sharing. In several medieval European cities, there are documented cases of vendors selling what the records describe as sugared almonds coated in a hardened sugar shell, at civic festivals and markets. This is the direct ancestor of what you now know as Jordan almonds or sugared almonds, which appear at weddings and celebrations across the Mediterranean world and beyond. The continuity of this particular food item across 7 or 8 centuries, from a medieval festival stall to a modern wedding favor bowl, is one of those moments where the distance between then and now collapses entirely. Someone is handing you a sugared almond at a medieval fair, and it is the same sugared almond that someone will hand you at a wedding in the 21st century. Some foods are just correct, apparently, and the world has the good sense to keep making them. Spiced nuts more broadly are a significant part of the medieval sweet and savory street food landscape, sitting in that interesting culinary middle ground where the line between sweet and savory is less clearly drawn than modern Western food culture tends to draw it. Medieval cooking is notably comfortable with combinations that modern palates sometimes find disorienting: sweet and sour together, sweet and salty together, fruit in meat dishes, spiced honey on roasted things, and the street food market reflects this comfort. A vendor selling roasted nuts with honey and pepper and ginger is not doing something experimental. They are doing something entirely conventional, and the combination works in exactly the way that any sweet, spicy, salty combination works, which is to say it works very well and is difficult to stop eating. The spices in these preparations connect the humble street vendor to something much larger and much more dramatic than a nut stall in a provincial market would seem to have any business being connected to: the global spice trade, which we are going to spend a full section on later because it absolutely deserves the attention. For now, just hold the thread. The ginger in your wafer, the cinnamon in the honey cake, the pepper on the roasted almonds. These flavors have traveled extraordinary distances to reach you, through trade networks of staggering complexity, and the fact that they are available at a street stall at all is a minor miracle of medieval globalization that tends to get underappreciated. As the morning tips over into early afternoon, the sweet stalls do good business with a particular demographic. Children, obviously, but also the slightly more prosperous shoppers who have finished their practical market business and are allowing themselves a small indulgence before heading home. The social function of the sweet street food stall is explicitly pleasurable in a way that the pottage stall is not. Nobody goes to buy a honey cake because they need the calories or not primarily. They go because it tastes good and because treating yourself to something sweet is a recognizably human impulse that does not require electricity or a credit card or a Deliveroo app. It just requires a small coin and the proximity of someone who has figured out how to make flour and honey into something worth pausing for. There is also a class of sweet street foods connected explicitly to the church calendar and to civic festivity. Special preparations made only at Christmas, or at Easter, or at midsummer fairs that carry their rarity as part of their value. Fritters are a good example. Battered and fried preparations, often sweet, that appear in medieval recipe collections in association with festive occasions and that have obvious street food potential given that they require only a pot of hot fat and a few simple ingredients. A fritter vendor at a medieval fair is doing business that is essentially identical in every structural sense to a churro stand at a modern theme park. And the people buying them have the same expression on their faces, the particular expression of someone eating something fried and sweet in a public space, which is an expression of pure, uncomplicated happiness that has apparently not changed in 700 years. You have 2 wafers now, and you have been standing near the wafer stall long enough that she has noticed and is watching you with the professionally neutral expression of someone who is open to further business but will not push it. The griddle irons hiss and steam each time she opens them. The pattern pressed into the wafer she is currently making is a simple geometric star, and when she lifts the finished wafer out and sets it on the cooling rack, it is for a moment genuinely beautiful. Pale gold at the edges, slightly darker at the center, the star pattern crisp and clean. You move on because the market demands movement, and because your curiosity is pulling you in another direction now. The afternoon crowd has a different texture from the morning crowd. There are more women with children. There are more people moving more slowly, looking rather than buying, browsing in the way that humans browse markets regardless of century. And there are, increasingly, people moving with cups rather than bowls, people who have transitioned from the solid business of eating to the liquid business of drinking, because in the medieval city, the line between the food market and the drink market is permeable and frequently crossed. You have been walking for what feels like hours. You are warm, you are fed, and your feet hurt in the way that all feet hurt on medieval street surfaces, which are not designed with comfort in mind. You could use a drink. The alehouse announces itself the way all the best alehouses do, which is to say it does not really announce itself at all. It simply becomes apparent in the way that a warm room becomes apparent when you step in from the cold, through an accumulation of sensory information that your brain assembles into a conclusion before you have consciously decided to pay attention. There is a bush. This is the sign. Literally, an actual bush or bundle of greenery, typically a branch of evergreen or a tied bunch of ivy or holly, hung above the door or on a pole outside. The ale stake, as it is sometimes called, is one of the most enduring pieces of commercial signage in the medieval world. And it is so universal that it generates a proverb, "Good wine needs no bush," meaning that a truly superior product advertises itself by reputation rather than requiring visible signposting. The proverb implies, with the gentle cynicism that proverbs tend toward, that a business displaying a very large and enthusiastic bush is perhaps compensating for something. The bush above this particular establishment is modest and well-maintained, which you choose to read as a good sign. Inside, and you step inside, because the afternoon has developed the drizzle that this morning's gray sky was threatening, and because you have earned a rest. The alehouse is a single room, low-ceilinged, with a packed earth floor covered in rushes that have been there long enough to have developed a character of their own. There are trestle tables, there are benches. There is a fire that is doing its job with commendable enthusiasm. Behind a wooden counter at one end of the room, a woman, the alewife, the female proprietor who is the statistical norm rather than the exception in this trade, at least in England during this period, is drawing ale from a large ceramic vessel with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this motion has become as automatic as breathing. Ale in the medieval world is so central to daily life that describing it as a drink feels slightly inadequate. It is a food. It is a medicine. It is a social institution. It is a caloric supplement for people whose solid food consumption is sometimes not quite sufficient for the energy demands placed on their bodies. A working adult in the medieval period might consume anywhere from a pint to a gallon of ale per day, the lower alcohol varieties, called small ale or table ale, being consumed almost continuously throughout the day in the way that a modern person might drink water or coffee. while stronger alesh are reserved for evenings, celebrations, and the kind of specific social occasions that benefit from a modest loosening of inhibitions. The ale being produced and sold in the medieval city is made from malted grain, usually barley, sometimes oats, sometimes a mixture, fermented with naturally occurring wild yeasts in a process that is considerably less controlled than modern brewing but that produces, when done well, a beverage that is genuinely pleasant and that has the additional virtue of being considerably safer to drink than much of the available water in a densely populated urban environment. This is the famous medieval people drank ale instead of water narrative, which is true in its broad outlines but requires some nuance. Water was not universally dangerous, and medieval people did drink it, particularly from known clean sources like wells and springs. But in cities, where the density of human and animal habitation creates real contamination risks for water sources, the mild antimicrobial properties of the fermentation process do give ale a genuine safety advantage, and the cultural preference for ale over water in urban contexts reflects a practical wisdom that has been accumulated through long experience rather than through any understanding of germ theory. The alewife who runs this establishment is, in the legal and commercial vocabulary of medieval England, an alewife in the original and technical sense, a woman who brews and sells ale as her primary trade. The brewing of ale in the medieval period is, at the household and small commercial scale, dominated by women to a degree that surprises people who assume that the food and drink trades were entirely male-controlled. The reasons for this are complex and debated, but they connect to the domestic context of small-scale brewing. It is work done in the home or in a home-adjacent space, using equipment that overlaps with household cooking equipment, requiring skills that are transmitted through female domestic networks, and to the particular economics of the trade, which at the small end is well suited to a family business model where the alewife brews, serves, and manages the commercial side while other household members assist. Historians still argue whether the feminization of the brewing trade in medieval England is a sign of relative female economic empowerment or simply a reflection of the trade's low status and thin margins in this period, whether women dominated brewing because it was a route to economic independence or because it was work that men did not particularly want. The truth is probably some complicated mixture of both, varying by location, period, and individual circumstance, and the records give us enough examples of genuinely prosperous and influential alewives to suggest that at least some women found in the trade a meaningful degree of financial autonomy. The ale you are handed now is served in a ceramic vessel, a small jug or a handled cup, and it is, let us be honest, a bit of an adjustment if your palate is calibrated to modern beer. It is cloudy because filtration is not part of the process. It is darker than you might expect, with a color that ranges from tawny to deep amber depending on how the malt was treated. It is slightly sour, because the wild fermentation introduces lactic bacteria along with the yeasts, giving it an edge that is not unpleasant but is distinctly different from the clean, controlled flavor profile of modern commercial brewing. It is not very alcoholic. This small ale is genuinely mild, somewhere around 1 to 2% alcohol, which means you would have to work quite hard to get into serious trouble with it, though the stronger alesh available in the evening are another matter entirely. It is, despite all of this, actually quite good. There is a roundness to it, a grain sweetness underneath the sourness, and it is served at cellar temperature, which on a cool day is refreshing in exactly the right way. You sit down on a bench and stretch your legs out and feel the accumulated miles of the morning market begin to release from your calves. The alehouse around you is doing what alehouses have always done, which is to serve simultaneously as a place of commerce, a place of community, and a place where the regulatory and social rules of the outside world are observed somewhat less rigorously than they are in the street. Not dramatically less rigorously. This is not a den of iniquity, at least not at this hour of the afternoon, but with the slightly relaxed quality that enclosed spaces with alcohol and fire have always generated. People are talking, not in the careful, guarded way of a public street, but in the more expansive, slightly louder way of people who feel temporarily insulated from the immediate consequences of being overheard. There is gambling happening at one of the tables. This is illegal, technically, because gambling is one of those activities that medieval authorities periodically attempt to suppress with bylaws and then give up on suppressing because human beings are going to roll dice regardless of what the municipal code says about it. The alewife glances at the dice game and then glances away in a manner that communicates perfectly that she has not seen it and will continue to not see it unless it becomes her problem in some more direct sense. There is also food here. This is important. The alehouse is not just a drinking establishment. The better-run ones serve food alongside the ale, and this is where the street food world and the drink world overlap in a productive and mutually reinforcing way. What is being served here is simple bread, obviously, because there is always bread. Some kind of cold meat or cheese, perhaps a bowl of something from a nearby cookshop, reheated or simply kept warm by proximity to the alehouse fire. It is not elaborate food. It is not trying to be. It is food calibrated to the specific purpose of providing something solid to consume alongside ale, which prevents the alcohol from landing too hard on an empty stomach and extends the customer's comfortable capacity to remain in the establishment spending money. Beyond ale, the medieval drink landscape is more varied than people tend to assume. Cider is widespread in apple-growing regions, the west of England, Normandy, the Basque Country, and occupies a similar cultural role to ale, being a fermented beverage of moderate strength made from locally available raw materials. Perry, made from pears, is less common but present. Wine is available in most medieval cities, imported from wine-growing regions, but it occupies a different social register from ale. It is more expensive, more associated with prosperity and sophistication, and consumed in different contexts. The tavern, which is technically distinct from the alehouse in that it focuses on wine rather than ale, is a slightly more upmarket establishment with a slightly different clientele, though the distinction blurs in practice. And then there are the herbal drinks, preparations made from plants steeped in hot water or wine, sometimes sweetened with honey, that occupy the medical and quasi-medical end of the beverage spectrum. These are not quite what we would call tea, because the specific plants involved are different from the Asian Camellia sinensis that produces what modern English speakers think of as tea, but they fill a similar cultural function. Certain herbs are understood to have specific physiological effects: warming, cooling, settling the stomach, clearing the head, and the woman at the corner of the market selling cups of hot herbal preparation is offering something that straddles the boundary between food, medicine, and comfort in a way that is deeply medieval and surprisingly modern simultaneously. There is a quirky detail buried in the history of medieval public drinking that I find irresistible every time I encounter it. In some medieval English towns, the practice of paying around, buying drinks for everyone in your group rather than each person paying for their own, is not just a social convention but is embedded in specific drinking rituals associated with civic occasions, guild meetings, and religious festivals. The word scot, as in getting off scot-free, comes from the medieval term for the share of a communal drinking bill, a scot being your portion of the collective tab. To go scot-free is to leave without paying your share, which in the context of a medieval alehouse communal drinking session is a social infraction of some seriousness. Language preserves the social reality of medieval drinking culture in ways that we use every day without noticing. The afternoon light is doing something interesting outside the alehouse's single small window, slanting and thickening in the way of late-day light, turning the street outside from the bright, busy white of midday into something warmer and more amber. You have been here longer than you planned, which is the correct amount of time to spend in a medieval alehouse and also in every alehouse that has existed since, because they are all optimized, through centuries of accumulated wisdom, to be exactly comfortable enough that leaving requires a conscious decision. You make the conscious decision. The drizzle has stopped. The air outside is cooler and damper than it was but not unpleasant, carrying the specific freshness of a city after rain, which in the medieval context is a meaningfully different freshness from the modern post-rain city smell, because what the rain is washing off the medieval street is considerably more organic than what it washes off a modern tarmac surface, and the resulting smell is rich and complex in ways that you have by now developed enough context to simply accept rather than recoil from. The market is changing character. The morning vendors are winding down. New vendors are appearing, people who operate specifically in the afternoon and evening trade, when the crowd shifts in composition and the things people want to buy shift accordingly. The frantic productivity energy of the morning has given way to something slightly more leisurely, slightly more social, slightly more oriented toward pleasure rather than necessity. And threading through the afternoon air, above all the other smells you have accumulated over the course of this long and eventful day, there is something new, something sharp and particular and instantly arresting, something that your nose registers not as food exactly but as the promise of food, as flavor in concentrated, potent form, as the ghost of somewhere very far away. Spice. The spice seller's stall stops you in your tracks the way very few things in this market have managed to do, and you have by now seen quite a lot. It is not the largest stall. It is not the loudest. The spice seller is not calling his wares with the extroverted enthusiasm of the pieman or the breadwoman. He is doing something closer to the opposite, standing behind his display with a composed, proprietary stillness that communicates, without words, that the goods on his table do not require aggressive salesmanship because they sell themselves, and that anyone who needs to be persuaded probably cannot afford them anyway. This is a merchant who understands that scarcity is its own advertisement, and that the correct way to sell something rare is to let the rarity speak. What is on the table speaks very loudly indeed. The colors alone are extraordinary. You have spent the morning in a visual world that is, by modern standards, relatively muted. The browns and grays of stone and timber and undyed wool, the dull green of vegetation past its best, the ochre of dried mud, the occasional flash of a dyed fabric or a painted sign. Against all of that, the spice seller's display is almost hallucinatory. There is the vivid amber orange of saffron, arranged in small careful heaps that look almost luminous against the dark cloth beneath them. There is the warm red-brown of cinnamon bark, curled into scrolls like tiny fragrant manuscripts. There is the dusty gray-green of dried ginger, and the glossy black of whole peppercorns piled in small ceramic dishes, and the startling red of dried chili. No, wait, chili has not arrived in Europe yet. We are centuries before Columbus, and what looks red is actually a powder of some other dried fruit or berry, possibly cubeb, possibly grains of paradise, possibly something that the spice seller is being deliberately vague about because vagueness allows for flexible pricing. The smell, when you lean close enough, is so concentrated and so complex that it briefly reorganizes your entire sensory experience of the market around itself. Pepper is the dominant note, black pepper, the most traded, most valuable, most culturally significant spice in medieval European commerce, the thing that a medieval merchant means when they say spices in the most generic and sweeping sense. But underneath the pepper there is the sweetness of cinnamon and the sharper medicinal warmth of ginger and the floral strangeness of cloves and something else, something resinous and slightly smoky that you cannot quite identify, that the spice seller sees you trying to identify and holds up a small lump of for your inspection without yet telling you what it is. It is mastic, a resin from a specific tree grown primarily on the Greek island of Chios, used as a flavoring, a medicine, a chewing gum, and a breath freshener, and sufficiently specific to its source that the island's trade in it constitutes a genuine geographic monopoly. This is the medieval spice trade in miniature, a product that grows in one very specific place, moves through a chain of intermediaries across thousands of miles, and arrives here on this table in a northern European market at a price that reflects every hand it has passed through and every mile it has traveled. The mastic is not cheap. Almost nothing on this table is cheap. But people buy it anyway because the things you can do with it, the flavors you can create, the social signals you can send, the medical problems you can potentially address, are worth the price to the people who can afford to pay it. Pepper deserves its own moment here because its importance in the medieval world is so outsized relative to what it is. A dried berry, fundamentally, from a vine that grows in South and Southeast Asia, that understanding it properly requires a small recalibration of your instincts. You shake pepper onto your eggs without thinking about it. You have a pepper grinder on your kitchen counter that costs less than your monthly streaming subscription. The idea that pepper was once so valuable that it was used as currency, that rents were paid in it, that a man's wealth could be measured in his pepper inventory, requires you to hold two incompatible realities in your head simultaneously until they resolve into something coherent. The coherence comes when you trace the supply chain. Pepper grows in India and Southeast Asia. Getting it from there to a market stall in medieval England or France or Germany involves a journey of thousands of miles through multiple political entities, each of which takes its cut. Arab merchants dominate the Indian Ocean trade routes. The goods pass through Persian Gulf ports or Red Sea ports and then overland to Mediterranean coast cities, where Italian merchants, Venetians and Genoese above all, with an almost modern ferocity of commercial competition, buy them and ship them north and west through Europe. Every transfer involves a markup. Every border involves a toll. Every middleman is in business for themselves. By the time the pepper reaches your spice seller's table in a northern market town, it has been handled by perhaps a dozen different commercial actors across 3 continents and has accumulated a price that reflects every one of them. The result is that pepper costs what it costs, and what it costs is enough that its presence in food is a social statement as much as a culinary one. A dish heavily spiced with pepper is a dish whose maker is telling you something about their economic situation, and what they are telling you is that they have the resources to be casual about expensive imports. This is why spices appear so prominently in medieval recipes aimed at wealthy households. Not because wealthy medieval people had taste buds that required more stimulation, but because spices in food are a visible, olfactory, gustatory display of affluence in a world where displaying affluence is socially important and the means of doing so are somewhat limited compared to modern options. At the street food level, this means spices are present but carefully deployed. The pieman adds a pinch of ginger to his filling. The honey cake vendor works cinnamon into the dough. The pottage sold at the better end of the cookshop market has a whisper of pepper in its broth. These are not generous applications. They are precise, calculated additions that do maximum flavor work for minimum expenditure, and the skill with which a street food vendor manages their spice budget is a genuine marker of their culinary competence. Ginger is perhaps the most democratic of the major spices at the street level, because it is available in several forms: fresh, dried, powdered, preserved in syrup at different price points, and because it has such a clearly defined and broadly appealing flavor profile that it works in an enormous range of applications. Ginger in a honey cake, ginger in a wafer batter, ginger in a meat pie, ginger in a hot drink. It functions across the sweet-savory spectrum with versatile ease, and the medieval street food vendor who has learned to use it well has a tool that adds perceived value to their product at relatively manageable cost. Saffron is at the opposite end of the accessibility spectrum. It is, then as now, the most expensive spice by weight in the world, derived from the dried stigmas of a specific crocus flower, each of which must be harvested by hand, with an extraordinarily large number of flowers required to produce even a tiny amount of usable spice. Its primary contribution to food, at the street level, is color rather than flavor. That extraordinary golden yellow that medieval cooks prize partly for its beauty and partly because golden yellow food reads as rich, luxurious, and associated with gold itself in a symbolic vocabulary that the period takes quite seriously. A pottage tinted golden with saffron is a pottage that is announcing its own quality before you have tasted a spoonful, and the cook who can afford to make that announcement regularly is a cook whose establishment is doing well. There is a gloriously quirky footnote to the saffron story that belongs specifically to medieval England. The town of Saffron Walden in Essex gets its name from the saffron crocus cultivation that was practiced there from at least the 14th century, making it one of the few places in northern Europe where the spice was actually grown domestically rather than imported. The English climate is not ideal for crocus cultivation, and the local product was apparently more expensive to produce than the imported variety because of the labor costs. But it existed, it was traded, and it left its mark on a town's name in a way that persists to the present day. Every time you drive past the Saffron Walden sign on the A505, you are reading a 700-year-old advertisement for a medieval spice trade. The connection between the spice trade and the street food vendor is mediated by a figure who deserves more attention than they usually get, the apothecary or spicer, who operates at the wholesale and semi-wholesale level of the spice market, and who is the commercial link between the great international trading networks and the individual vendor buying a small portion for their week's production. The apothecary in the medieval city is not quite a pharmacist in the modern sense, though medicine is very much part of their trade. Spices are understood to have significant medicinal properties in the humoral medical theory that dominates medieval thinking about health, and the line between flavoring food and treating an ailment is not always clearly drawn. The apothecary sells you pepper for your pottage and also sells you pepper for your digestion, and the transaction is not fundamentally different in their mind. Historians still argue whether the famous claim that spices were used to mask the flavor of rotting meat is an accurate description of medieval culinary practice or a later myth that emerged from misunderstanding of the sources. The current scholarly consensus leans fairly firmly toward myth. Spices were expensive enough that you would not waste them on meat so far gone that no amount of pepper could save it, and the people buying and selling spiced food were not so naive as to think flavoring could substitute for safety. The reality is more interesting than the myth. Spices were used because people genuinely liked them, because they signaled wealth, and because the medical theory of the time genuinely believed they promoted health and good digestion. The rotting meat story tells us more about later centuries' assumptions about medieval people than it tells us about medieval people themselves. What the spice trade does to street food, in practical terms, is create a flavor landscape that is in some ways richer and more complex than you might expect and in other ways more restricted than modern cooking. The medieval street food vendor has access to flavors from India, from Southeast Asia, from the Middle East and North Africa, carried through some of the most sophisticated long-distance trade networks in human history. But they have limited access to ingredients that modern cooks consider utterly basic. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no peppers, no chocolate, no vanilla, all of which are New World ingredients centuries away from their European debut. The flavor world of medieval street food is simultaneously more exotic and more limited than the modern equivalent, and navigating the map of what is and is not available requires a conscious reset of your culinary assumptions. The spice seller you are standing in front of now is toward the upper end of the street food supply chain. He is not selling to individuals making single meals, but to the vendors and small producers who will incorporate his goods into food for others. He deals in quantity, even if the quantities are, by modern standards, small. He knows the prices, he knows the supply situation, he knows which trade routes have been disrupted by political instability or bad weather, and he prices accordingly. He is, in his way, a man with a sophisticated understanding of a global economy, even if the word global is one he does not have and the concept of an economy is one he would not recognize by that name. You ask him about the unidentified resinous lump, the mastic, and he tells you, in the mixture of gesture and simplified vocabulary that serves as the lingua franca of a market where not everyone shares a native language, where it comes from and what it does and what it costs. The price is, unsurprisingly, beyond what you have in your pocket for an impulse purchase. You thank him and move on, and he returns to his proprietary stillness, waiting for the next customer with the patience of a man whose goods will sell regardless. The afternoon is getting longer now, the shadows in the street leaning eastward with increasing commitment. The spice seller's display catches the late light and does extraordinary things with it. The saffron glowing, the cinnamon catching warm highlights, the black pepper absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. A dark pool of value on a bright afternoon. You carry the smell with you as you move away from the stall. It clings to your clothes in the way that concentrated aromatics always do, a portable memory of the transaction, a ghost of distant places riding on your sleeve through a northern European market street. The ginger, the cinnamon, the pepper, all of it so ordinary to you in your own time, so extraordinary here, trailing the shadow of every mile it traveled to reach this table. The market is beginning its afternoon shift. New voices are rising, new smells are emerging. And somewhere ahead, in a direction you cannot quite identify yet, something is happening that does not smell of food at all. Something sharper, something with an edge of confrontation to it. The particular auditory texture of a dispute that has moved past the stage of polite disagreement and into something more interesting. You should probably go and see what it is. The crowd has formed the way medieval crowds always form around trouble. Not with the self-conscious gathering of people who have decided to watch something, but with the organic, almost gravitational inevitability of a population that has learned, through long experience, that public disputes have consequences for everyone and that staying informed is a survival strategy as much as it is entertainment. You edge toward the outer ring of the crowd and find a position from which you can see without being immediately visible yourself, which is a skill that every urban dweller in every century has independently developed and which requires no particular instruction. What you are looking at, once you have oriented yourself, is a confrontation between a market inspector and a baker, and it is already past the stage of initial accusation and well into the stage of theatrical mutual indignation that suggests both parties have been in this position before and have their respective performances well rehearsed. The market inspector, called a clerk of the market in England, or by various equivalent titles in other European cities, or simply the man with the scales, which is the functional description that cuts across linguistic boundaries, is holding a loaf of bread in one hand and a set of weights in the other, and the expression on his face is the expression of a professional who has caught someone doing exactly what he expected them to be doing and is now engaged in the bureaucratic pleasure of being officially correct. The loaf is underweight. This is not a subtle discrepancy. The gap between what the loaf should weigh under the current assize price for this grade of bread, and what it actually weighs is enough that the inspector does not need to perform careful measurement to demonstrate the problem. The scales tell the story immediately and unambiguously, and several members of the gathered crowd, who have their own reasons for caring deeply about bread weights, are nodding with the grim satisfaction of people whose suspicions have been confirmed. The baker is not going quietly. He is a man of perhaps 45, broad through the shoulders in the way of people who have spent decades working with dough, and he has clearly decided that his best strategy is volume. Not the volume of a guilty man trying to talk his way past evidence, but the volume of a man who has a genuine grievance underneath the fraudulent one, and who is going to make sure everyone in earshot hears about it. The grain prices, he is saying. The grain prices this season have been extraordinary, ruinous, the product of a harvest that was bad in ways that the assize formula does not adequately account for. And if the inspector wants to apply the letter of the law to a man who has done his best in impossible circumstances, then that is a fine example of what the law is worth, and he has opinions about what the law is worth. This is, to be fair, not an entirely dishonest argument. The system of price and weight control that governs bread in the medieval city is calibrated to a model of grain price fluctuation that assumes a certain range of variation, and when grain prices move outside that range, as they do during bad harvests, during supply disruptions, during the aftermath of military conflict that damages agricultural land, the formula breaks down in ways that genuinely do squeeze the baker's margin. The city authorities are aware of this. The adjustments they make are sometimes adequate and sometimes not, and the gap between formula and reality is one that bakers fill with the quiet, semi-systematic underweighting that the inspector is currently catching them at. Historians still argue whether food fraud in the medieval city was primarily a product of deliberate dishonesty, economic desperation, or the structural inadequacy of regulatory systems that were genuinely trying to serve the public interest but were working with imperfect tools. The honest answer is probably all three, in proportions that varied enormously by individual, location, and circumstance, and the court records that document prosecutions are not well suited to telling us which motivation applied in any given case because the legal system is not interested in motivation in the way that a historian or a psychologist might be. It is interested in the fact of the violation and the application of the penalty. The penalties are worth spending a moment on because they are both more creative and more socially sophisticated than simple fines. The bread dragging, the hurdle ride with the offending loaf tied around the baker's neck, that we mentioned earlier is the classic English punishment, and it is not the only one. In some continental European cities, the offending baker is placed in a basket or chair and dunked in a convenient body of water, which achieves the dual purpose of public humiliation and the kind of mild physical discomfort that makes the experience memorable without causing lasting harm. In other jurisdictions, the baker is required to give the underweight bread to the poor, which converts the fraud into an involuntary act of charity in a way that is either elegantly just or deeply ironic depending on your perspective. The fine, when it is levied, goes not just to the city but sometimes partially to the informer, the person who reported the fraud, which creates a small but real financial incentive for members of the public to pay attention to the transactions happening around them and report irregularities. This is surveillance funded by the market itself, and it is surprisingly effective, because the medieval city is a place where privacy is limited and everyone is already watching everyone else as a matter of course. And giving that watching a financial reward simply formalizes what is already happening. Bread fraud is the most documented form of food fraud in the medieval city because bread regulation is the most elaborate and the records are therefore the most detailed. But it is very far from the only form. The meat trade generates its own rich archive of complaint and prosecution that reveals, in aggregate, a food supply operating under the constant low-level tension between what the regulations require and what the economic realities of the trade make practical. The butchers are among the most regulated tradespeople in the medieval city, and for very good reason. The consequences of eating bad meat are fast, severe, and potentially lethal in a world without antibiotics or sophisticated medical intervention. The rules governing the sale of meat in most medieval cities are extensive. Animals must be slaughtered in designated locations, usually away from the main market to minimize the worst of the sensory experience for passing shoppers, though the designation of these locations and the degree to which butchers actually comply with them is a matter of continuous negotiation. Meat must be sold fresh on the day of slaughter or, at the outside, the day following. Meat that is beginning to turn must not be sold for human consumption. It can go to animal feed, it can be declared waste, but it cannot be passed off as fresh product to an unsuspecting customer. The gap between must not and is not is, in the medieval meat trade, a very populated gap indeed. The mechanisms of fraud are varied and ingenious, which tells you something about the creativity that commercial pressure can unlock in human beings across all centuries. The most straightforward method is simply to sell old meat as fresh, relying on the customer's limited ability to inspect what they are buying before the transaction is complete. More elaborate methods involve treating meat with substances that mask the signs of deterioration: blood to restore color, vinegar to reduce smell, spices, as we noted in our spice section, to overlay the developing odors of age with something more appealing. There are documented cases of meat being soaked in water to plump it up and increase its apparent weight. There are cases of the less desirable parts of an animal being incorporated into preparations, pies, sausages, pottage, where the mixing of ingredients makes individual component quality harder to assess. The sausage deserves a particular mention here because it is, from the perspective of food fraud opportunity, perhaps the most vulnerable product in the medieval meat market. A sausage is, by definition, a mixture of chopped or ground meat in a casing, and the combination of mixing and encasing makes it uniquely resistant to quality inspection by the consumer. The medieval sausage maker has ample opportunity, and the medieval records suggest that ample opportunity was not consistently declined. Court documents from several European cities describe prosecuted sausage makers whose products contained proportions of fat, offal, and unidentified filler that were considerably higher than what the customer was paying for, and in at least one memorably documented London case, a sausage maker was prosecuted for incorporating meat from an animal that had died of illness rather than slaughter, the precise illness being helpfully noted in the court record in a way that makes the whole thing considerably worse to read than it needs to be. The fish trade has its own fraud landscape, shaped by the particular preservation challenges of fish and the complexity of the market that surrounds it. Fresh fish spoils faster than almost any other food, and the signals of spoilage, smell, texture, appearance are well known to experienced buyers but can be masked or disguised well enough to deceive a less experienced one. Salt fish and dried fish are more stable but have their own quality gradations, and the temptation to sell lower quality preserved fish at higher quality prices is one that the records show being regularly succumbed to. The fish market inspectors, a distinct category of official in many large medieval cities, reflecting the importance and complexity of the trade, are kept busy in a way that suggests their job security was never in question. Beyond the products themselves, the fraud landscape of the medieval market includes a range of practices around measures and weights that are so widespread and so systematically documented that they amount to a structural feature of the market rather than a series of individual bad actors. Measures for liquid products, ale, wine, oil, were supposed to be standardized, and standardized vessels were supposed to be in use. The actual vessels in use were frequently non-standard, sometimes in ways that are obviously intentional and sometimes in ways that reflect the genuine difficulty of maintaining precise standardization in a world without industrial manufacturing. A ceramic jug is not a precision instrument. It is a handmade object with natural variation, and whether the short measure it delivers is fraud or tolerance depends on how carefully the maker calibrated it and how carefully the seller has thought about that calibration. The ale trade is particularly rich in documented measurement fraud, partly because ale is sold in volume and volume is easily manipulated, and partly because the consumption context, an alehouse where the customer is already partway through a drinking session and therefore not at their most precise, is favorable to the seller who wants to err on the side of a slightly generous measure of nothing. The ale measure inspector, who visits alehouses with a set of official vessels to test the house measures against, is a figure who appears in municipal records with great regularity and who generates a paper trail of fines and repeat offenders that reads like an extremely boring soap opera spread over decades. The vegetable and grain markets have their own fraud traditions, somewhat less dramatic but economically significant. Grain measured with false-bottomed containers, produce displayed with the best items on top and inferior items beneath, dried goods sold damp to increase their weight. Fresh goods claimed to have come from a high-quality source when they actually came from a less prestigious one. None of this is unique to the medieval period. Every market in the history of human commerce has generated the same incentive structures and the same responses to them. But the medieval city's documentation of these practices is unusually detailed because the regulatory apparatus is unusually engaged. And this is where the medieval city reveals something genuinely interesting about itself. The fraud is extensive, the regulation is elaborate, the enforcement is energetic if imperfect, and the system nevertheless functions. People are fed. The city continues. The market opens every morning and the vendors set up their stalls and the customers come and make their purchases, operating in a state of calibrated, experience-informed distrust that is nevertheless compatible with a functioning commercial ecosystem. Medieval consumers are not naive. They have developed sophisticated practical knowledge about where to buy, from whom, at what times, and for what products. They know which vendors are trustworthy and which require watchful management. They know how to inspect a loaf, how to smell a fish, how to press a pie crust to get a sense of what is inside it. They are not victims of a corrupt system so much as active participants in a system whose imperfections they understand and navigate accordingly. The inspector, in the scene you have been watching, has concluded his business with the baker. A fine has been assessed. The amount has been argued over, the argument has been lost by the baker, and the fine has been recorded in the clerk's book with the practiced efficiency of a man who fills in this particular blank in this particular document with some regularity. The crowd, having received the resolution it came for, begins to disperse. Not quickly, because medieval crowds do not disperse quickly, and anyway several side conversations have developed in the outer ring of observers that are now more interesting than the central event. And the market resumes its afternoon character. The baker, fine assessed and performance concluded, goes back to his stall. There is bread to sell and afternoon remains, and whatever his feelings about the morning's drama, commerce does not pause for feelings. He straightens his display, adjusts the loaves, and adopts the forward-facing expression of a man who is open for business and would prefer to draw a line under recent events. You watch him for a moment with a mixture of sympathy and the particular satisfaction that comes from having witnessed something genuinely instructive about the texture of daily life in a period that can feel, from the distance of centuries, abstract and unreachable. The medieval city is not abstract. It is bread waits and market inspectors and bakers with genuine economic grievances and a crowd of ordinary people who need to know whether the loaves they are buying will actually sustain them through the next working day. The light is changing again. The afternoon is getting serious about becoming evening. Stalls that have been running since dawn are beginning to pack up. The vendor's energy visibly shifting from the forward-looking enterprise of a full trading day to the backward-looking accounting of a day concluding. Baskets are being counted. Remaining stock is being assessed for what can be held over and what must be sold now at any price before it loses whatever value it still has. The market at the end of the day is a different place from the market at the beginning, and you have been here long enough to feel that difference, not just observe it, but feel it in the quality of the light and the shift in the crowd's energy and the particular kind of tiredness that comes from having been present and attentive for many hours in a place that demands both. The last light of the day is beginning to do something beautiful to the rooftops. The shadows arrive the way they always do in a medieval city. Not gradually, the way they arrive in an open landscape where the light dies by degrees across a wide sky, but suddenly, pooling in the narrow streets between buildings that lean toward each other overhead in a way that cuts the direct sunlight off like a door closing. One moment the cobbles are still catching the last warm angle of afternoon light. The next they are in deep shade, and the temperature drops by enough degrees that you pull whatever you are wearing a little tighter and feel the day shift beneath you from one mode to another. The vendors feel it too. There is a specific choreography to the closing of a medieval market that you have not witnessed before today, and that is, now that you are seeing it, quietly beautiful in the way that any highly practiced collective human behavior becomes beautiful when you watch it with attention. It is not chaotic. It does not happen all at once. It happens in waves, rippling outward from the vendors who have sold their entire stock first, the ones who arrived early with the best goods and the most favorable positions, and spreading gradually to the ones who are still haggling over their last few items with the diminishing afternoon crowd, trying to convert inventory into coin before the light makes the transaction genuinely impractical. The breadwomen go first, typically, because bread that is not sold by end of day becomes tomorrow's problem in ways that most other goods do not. What remains in their baskets at this hour is distributed with a calculation that is both practical and, in its medieval context, theologically inflected. The truly unsellable bread goes to whoever is waiting at the edge of the market for exactly this moment, the people at the very bottom of the urban economic hierarchy, for whom the day's stale leavings from a market basket are a meaningful contribution to survival. This distribution is not charity in the modern bureaucratic sense. It is not organized or overseen or recorded. It is simply what happens because in a city without food banks or food stamps or any formalized safety net below the level of the parish and the monastery, the informal economy of end-of-day food distribution is one of the things that stands between the very poor and genuine starvation. And everyone involved understands this without needing to articulate it. The pieman who served you this morning, or a pieman very like him, since in a market of this size there are several, is packing his tray with the particular care of someone who is accounting for every item remaining on it. Unsold pies present a different problem from unsold bread. Bread goes stale but does not typically present an immediate safety risk for the first day or two. A pie that has been sitting at ambient temperature since morning is a more complicated proposition, and the pieman's relationship with his remaining stock at the end of the day is one of those areas where the medieval food economy's logic is both entirely rational and, from a modern food safety perspective, slightly alarming. The pies will be sold. How and to whom depends on their condition, which the pieman assesses with the experienced nose and hands of someone who has learned, through years of practice and presumably some instructive early mistakes, exactly what the threshold is. The cookshop is still going and will go for some time yet. Evening is in many ways the cookshop's best hour, because the population that has been working all day is coming home hungry and has neither the energy nor the time to cook even if they had the means, and the hot food available from the cookshop represents the path of least resistance to a satisfying meal. The pots have been running since before dawn, which means their contents have been developing for 12 or more hours by this point, and what was a thin pottage at breakfast has become, through the long alchemy of sustained heat and the addition of successive ingredients throughout the day, something considerably richer and more complex. This is the cookshop's evening offering, and it is, by the accounting of many hours' worth of accumulated flavor, probably the best thing it has served all day. The light from the cookshop hearth spills out into the darkening street with a warmth that is not just metaphorical. It is genuinely, physically warm. The radiant heat of a fire that has been going since the small hours reaching out into the evening chill and making the space in front of the shop's open face noticeably more comfortable than the street a few feet away. This is free warmth, available to anyone who stands near enough, and there are people taking advantage of it with the unself-conscious practicality of people for whom warmth is a resource to be gathered wherever it presents itself rather than something you simply adjust with a thermostat. You stand near the warmth for a moment and think about what this day has been. You have covered enormous distance, in the most non-literal sense. You started in the pale early morning with the city barely awake, threaded your way through the bread trade and its extraordinary regulatory complexity, stood in front of a pieman whose product was better than your caution wanted to admit and ate it anyway, found your way to the cookshop's patient pots and the particular satisfaction of food that has been tended rather than made, sampled the delicate craft of the waferer and the strategic sweetness of honey cakes and spiced nuts, sat in an alehouse that smelled of rushes and ale and the particular warm humanity of an enclosed space where people relax slightly, stood in front of a spice seller whose table connected this narrow street to the other side of the world, and watched a market inspector catch a baker in a fraud that was partly dishonesty and partly desperation and mostly the eternal human response to a system whose rules do not quite fit the reality they are trying to govern. What you have seen, assembled into something like a coherent picture, is a city that feeds itself with a sophistication and a complexity that the word medieval does not prepare you for. The word medieval, and this is perhaps the most important thing tonight's journey has tried to quietly argue, carries freight that it should not carry. It suggests simplicity, brutality, the absence of refinement, a kind of collective historical childhood before the world grew up into modernity. What the food tells you is something different. It tells you that the people living in this city are as fully human as you are, as various, as creative, as capable of pleasure and of fraud, as interested in flavor and comfort and the social dimensions of eating together. They are operating with different tools and different ingredients and within different regulatory and religious frameworks, but the fundamental project is identical to yours. Find something good to eat, share it with people you care about, make the best of what the day provides. The street food of the medieval city is not a curiosity or a historical footnote. It is a fully developed commercial and cultural ecosystem that serves millions of people across centuries with a range and a sophistication that the historical record, once you look at it properly, cannot help but reveal. The bakers with their legally mandated loaf sizes and their perpetually contested weights. The pie men with their tray-borne mysteries and their practiced market cries. The aloives with their cloudy, caloric, safely fermented product and their complicated legal status. The spice sellers connecting northern street markets to Indian pepper vines through chains of commerce that span the known world. The cookshop proprietors maintaining their fires from before dawn to well after dark, feeding the city's working population with the patient, skilled, unspectacular competence of people doing necessary work well. The darkness is settling now with genuine commitment. The torches and candles that mark the doorways of the alehouses and the few establishments that continue to trade into the evening hours create small pools of yellow light that make the street between them darker by contrast. The market's daytime character, noisy, crowded, smelling of everything simultaneously, is giving way to something quieter and more selective. The vendors who remain are the evening vendors, a different cohort from the morning crew, operating in a different register. There are still things to eat. There will always, in a city of this size and this appetite, be things to eat. The roasted chestnut seller appears in autumn markets as naturally as the season itself, working a small brazier with a long-handled pan. The chestnuts splitting and sweetening in the heat and throwing off a smell that is one of the most purely comforting things the medieval street has to offer. Starchy and warm and slightly smoky, and belonging so completely to the cold air evening context that the smell and the season are essentially inseparable in the memory of anyone who has encountered them together. There are people selling hot spiced wine from ceramic pitchers kept warm at the edges of fire, and the spice in it, the cinnamon, the ginger, the clove, is doing something gentle and lovely in combination with the grape and the heat, making a drink that exists specifically to be consumed in cool air after a long day. The city at evening has a human scale that the city at midday does not. The crowd has thinned to the point where individual people are visible as individuals rather than as elements of a mass, and you can see them in a way that was not possible this morning. The woman hurrying home with a bundle, the man pausing to buy the last of a vendor's stock at a reduced price, the children who should probably be inside by now but are making the most of the remaining freedom of the street, the older person sitting on a step outside an alehouse with a cup of something and an expression of complete temporal detachment, as though the evening belongs to them personally and they have no intention of returning it until they are ready. The great medieval question of what happens to the city's food waste is one that modern sensibilities find interesting and medieval sensibilities would find puzzling, because in a world of genuine resource scarcity, the concept of food waste as a category is largely theoretical. What cannot be sold is given away or traded down the social hierarchy until it reaches someone for whom it still has value. What cannot be eaten by humans goes to pigs and chickens and dogs and the various other animals that exist in comfortable proximity to the medieval urban food system in ways that would astonish and possibly horrify a modern city planner. The line between the human food economy and the animal food economy is permeable in both directions. Animals eat what humans cannot, and then humans eat the animals, and the system's efficiency, from the perspective of total caloric utilization, is actually quite impressive by modern standards. Historians still argue whether the medieval urban food system was, on balance, adequate to the nutritional needs of the population it served, or whether chronic undernutrition was a widespread and structurally embedded feature of daily life for the urban poor. The evidence suggests the answer varies significantly by period, by location, by economic conditions, and by individual circumstance, and that averages are misleading when the distribution is as unequal as it is in the medieval city. What the street food economy provides is not equality of nutrition. It has never claimed to provide that, but accessibility of hot food at multiple price points, and that accessibility is real and meaningful and more sophisticated in its operation than it is usually given credit for being. The rooftops are doing something lovely now in the last of the light. The higher parts of the city, the church towers, the upper floors of the larger buildings, the occasional glimpse of a castle wall above the roofline, are still in faint gold while the streets below are in deep shadow, and the effect is of a city that is simultaneously finishing its day and holding onto the memory of it, unwilling to release the light entirely even as the dark arrives. You have a chestnut in your hand. It is warm, slightly charred at the edges where the split in the shell let the heat in directly, and when you peel back the outer layer, the inner flesh is the color of pale gold and steaming slightly and smells of everything that is good about autumn and fire and simple food made with care. You eat it standing in the street in the cooling evening air, and it is perfect in the way that very simple things are perfect. Not because they are complex or surprising or technically accomplished, but because they are exactly right for the moment they occupy. And the moment they occupy is exactly this one. The medieval street food vendor packing up their stall as the evening arrives is not a figure of pathos or of historical quaintness. They are a businessperson concluding a working day, an essential node in a distribution network that keeps a city alive, a skilled practitioner of crafts that have been refined across generations, a human being who is tired and probably hungry and thinking about the specific, personal things that tired and hungry people think about at the end of long days in every century. They are not so different from you. They are, in the ways that matter most, exactly like you. The fire in the cookshop hearth is banking down now, the proprietor managing the coals with the end-of-day economy of someone who is thinking about tomorrow's lighting as much as tonight's closing. The ale stake above the alehouse door is just visible in the near dark. That modest bush announcing its establishment to whoever is still abroad in the street and in need of what it has to offer. The bread baskets are empty. The pies are gone. The spice seller's table is covered and locked, and the extraordinary colors of the afternoon are put away until tomorrow. The city is quieting. Not silent. Medieval cities are never truly silent. The proximity of animals and people and the sounds of household life ensuring that there is always some level of ambient noise, but quieter, and the quiet has a different texture from the silence of emptiness. It is the quiet of fullness, of a population fed and sheltered and moving through the transition from the public day to the private evening, and it is a sound, if you can call quiet a sound, that is deeply, essentially human. You stand in it for a moment longer, your chestnut finished, your feet properly tired, your mind full of bread and pottage and spice and ale, and the face of the baker arguing his case to the market inspector, and the waferer lifting her beautiful golden wafer from the iron mold, and the pieman's cry threading through the morning crowd like a musical instrument playing a single repeated note. Let all of it settle now. Let the market go quiet. Let the fires bank down and the vendors go home and the street return to whatever peace a medieval street finds in the hours before the next dawn breaks, and the whole extraordinary, hungry, human business begins again. And now, as the story of this day winds itself down to its last soft thread, let the city fade gently behind you. You do not need to hold on to it. It will be there, 700 years in the past, doing exactly what it has always done. Feeding itself, arguing about bread weights, burning things over open fires, making the best of spices that have traveled impossible distances to flavor something humble and warm. It will be fine without your attention. Let your own body settle now, the way the cookshop fire settles at the end of a long day. Feel the weight of you against whatever surface is holding you, the mattress, the pillow, the particular comfortable geography of where you have arranged yourself for the night. That weight is good. It means you are here, and here is a good place to be. The medieval street is quieting in your mind, the voices fading, the smells softening from vivid and immediate to something gentler and more distant, like a memory of warmth rather than warmth itself. The pieman's cry is very far away now. The bread is baked and cooled and given away. The spices are packed and locked, and the colors of them, that saffron gold, that cinnamon warmth, that deep black pepper dark, are becoming the colors behind your closed eyes rather than the colors of a market stall in a long-ago city. You are warm. You are still. The day, your day, this day, wherever and whenever it has found you, is done, and you have done enough in it, and now the only thing required of you is to let it go. The medieval city fed its people every day, through cold and rain and fraud and regulation, and the tireless human effort of thousands of hands that knew how to make something good from what was available. It managed. It always managed. And so, in all the ways that matter, will you breathe out, let the market go, sleep well,